Hey guys, welcome back. So today we are working on this 6500 watt MegaForce generator. This is powered by a Generac engine and is essentially a Generac XL series. This is a very nice engine. It actually has a pressurized oil system and an oil filter. Not many generators can make that claim, although this one might have a Fram on there, so that could be the problem. Anyway, this was dropped off by a local subscriber. He actually keeps this up at his cabin. He has put a lot of hours on this machine. The counter actually says 1100, if I remember right. And he said that stopped working quite some time ago. So he actually estimates this has closer to 3,000 hours on the machine. Anyway, he was using it recently at his cabin running on propane when the engine started to bog really bad and it was smoking quite a lot. So he assumed either he blew the engine or potentially just overloaded it. So he shut it down, brought it home to his house, and subsequently ran it on gasoline, and it ran just fine. So we're not really sure what the story is here, but I don't think he's very optimistic about it because he also dropped off a gasket kit with the machine. So yeah, I'm going to start this one a little bit backwards. I'm going to get it running first on gasoline and we'll load test it. We'll see if it's down on horsepower. Depending upon how that goes, we'll hook up the propane and we'll try running this off a different fuel and see if there's any change in how this machine runs. And yes, I did check the oil. The oil's full and recently changed. It looks brand new. That wasn't good. I'd say we're not off to a good start. So I just tried starting it and was actually surprised. There was a lot of resistance pulling it over, so I didn't get a good pull out of it. And the engine actually did fire, but the engine spun backwards. So now the recoil, I can pull it out with extreme force, but it doesn't go back in. So I don't know if we have a recoil issue or an engine issue or maybe both. So I'm going to get the bolts off that recoil and we'll just take that out of the mix, see if the engine moves any better. Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The starter cup looks damaged. You can see right there, and actually the whole shape is kind of oval. The engine, though, feels fine when rotating it. And if you look at the starter recoil assembly, this dog, actually both of them, are bent, which is why this isn't operating anymore. So yeah, definitely not off to a good start. So yeah, definitely a bad start. Gonna have to replace those parts for sure. But let's go old school here and try to pull start it with a rope. What could go wrong? So we finally got the engine started, but there is a little surge in it. And these engines, I have had issues with the governor sensitivity, so I'm thinking that could be the problem. You can see it right there in the Hertz gauge. It's bouncing up and down just a bit. Anyway, without a load, the THD is around 6.2%, so that's not too bad. And the sine wave doesn't look terrible, but I wouldn't say it looks great either. Anyway, let's put on a 2,000 watt load. And it's doing it, but it's surging. So yeah, that is not good. But let's bring the load up a little more. Let's see if it gets worse or better. So 4,000 watts, it smoothed out a little bit. Let's try 5,000 watts. That's pretty good. Let's try 6,000 watts. Nope. Yeah, we're having governor issues. Potentially spark plug issues too. So I'm going to let this cool down. I'm going to shut it down. And I'm going to make a small adjustment to that governor spring. And we'll try this again. So adding choke did not improve it at all, so it's not a carburetor issue. So we just got to find the right size here. It looks like an 8 fits. And what I suspect is that this spring needs to be one hole further out on the governor arm. That's going to make it less sensitive. Right now, I think it's so sensitive that it's kind of overcompensating, meaning, the engine slows down a little, the governor responds by allowing it to speed up, but it overspeeds and then overcompensates, and it kind of oscillates between the two. So by moving this further out, you're going to get a little bit more engine sag under load, but the governor should be stabilized. So I'm going to take this tension off. It'll just make it a little easier. And I've got to say, this machine is absolutely spotless for the amount of hours on it and just the general age of the machine. Virtually looks brand new. So let's actually take it off. Take that nut off all the way. And we can take all the tension off. And we're obviously going to have to reset the speed when we get this started again. So for now, I'm just going to put enough tension on it to get it somewhat close. And once restarted, we'll bring it up to 61.5 Hertz and try the same load test. Yeah, that might be too much actually. We'll back it off just a little. And let's try that. Alright, so it restarted without issue. We still have a little oscillation, so I don't know if that's going to be an issue or not. So let's put a 2000 watt load on. And yeah, this time it's running pretty much perfectly. Last time it wasn't doing that. Under 2000 watts. Let's try 4000. That's pretty good. 5000. Yeah, things are nice and stable. So let's try 6000. You know, last time we got a misfire. That might have been governor related, potentially spark related. So here we go at 6000. Seems fine. About 6500. Yeah, it's right at its limit, so I'm going to back off a little bit to 6000. And under pretty much a full load, THD is at 19.3%. And the sine wave, a little deformed, but fairly typical. So this machine, given its age and the amount of hours on it, it's actually performing quite well now that we made that small adjustment to the governor, at least on gasoline. So let's give us a second to cool down. You know, we'll switch fuels and see if it performs the same way. So we'll try this again, this time running on propane. Now, when running on propane, you do lose about 10% of the horsepower. So, you know, the best we're going to get out of this is 5,800 watts. And to start it, it can be difficult on propane. And given that the starter recoil is broken, I'm going to start it on gasoline. You know, right now the carburetor is full, but I am going to shut off the fuel valve so that, you know, it'll start, but it won't run for long. And when it goes to stall, then I'm going to open the valve, let the propane in, and that should take over. All right, we are switched over to propane. Now, I'm not going to bother checking the power quality stuff because that won't make any difference. Really, the biggest difference here is what's the max load and how well is it fueled, meaning is it running too rich or running too lean? There is actually an adjustment right here coming out of the regulator, so we might have to tune that a bit potentially. But let's start with 2,000 watts. Running pretty well. Let's try 4,000. No issues. 5,000. Yep. It's doing it. And theoretically we can get 5,500 out of this. So let's bump it up to 5,500. And we are getting that out of it. You know, I don't see any smoke. No concerns really. So, you know, I think this machine is healthy aside from the damage I caused trying to start it. So let's shut things down and fix the damage. Okay, so it is a few days later, and I was actually able to get the starter cup and the recoil as a kit. So it's not exactly the same part, meaning, Generac discontinued the original part for this machine, but it is superseded to this part. And even though it looks a little different, it should do it. So let's get the broken cup removed. We can get this one installed easy enough. And yeah, you can see it is a little different, but I think that's why it comes as a set. So yeah, let's get the cup replaced. And I think the hard part here is actually going to be torquing this down, because we need to hold the engine still in order to get this secured properly. So it looks like the cup is going to be fine. Now, we do need to torque this down to 90 foot-pounds, and that's going to be a little bit of a challenge, on this machine. On a lot of machines, you can actually rotate the piston to the bottom of its travel and fill a cylinder with some nylon rope to lock the engine up. That would be the easiest, but on this one, I don't think that's an option. This tin isn't going to really allow me to feed any nylon rope into that cylinder. So the other way is to actually hold the flywheel still using a strap wrench. And to do that, we're going to have to remove the airbox, the blower housing, likely the recoil, and potentially the carburetor. So let's get those parts off so we can get this torqued to 90 foot-pounds. Yeah, and the carb needs to come off too, because the blower housing isn't going to come off with the carb in the way. And actually, we might be able to slide it forward a bit. So let's disconnect the linkage, and we'll try that route first. And we also need to disconnect the governor spring because it's attached to the blower housing. So we're going to have to reset the engine speed as well. No, we're going to have to pull the carb off. The governor linkage goes through the blower housing. So I really need to slide this pretty far forward. I can't really sneak it out. Yeah, I've got to admit, this I'm a little bit leery about because the flywheel is pretty thin. You know, I don't want to break one of these fins. And I'm also up against this backing right here, which is part of the system that directs the air over the head. So I'm going to have to be careful here. I really don't want to cause any more damage. All right, now we can get this back together. And we're going to have to test it again just to make sure that it still works properly. And to set the gap, business card works well. Needs to be about 0.010 of an inch. So I'm going to center the magnet under the coil. And then we just loosen up the bolts. The magnet should pull it tight. And then we'll snug these back up. And this doesn't have to be tight. These bolts are actually pretty small and the threads strip out real easy. So now that the gap is set, we just want to get the business card out. And we want to rotate the engine at least once manually and make sure that the ignition coil is not rubbing anywhere on the flywheel. And in this case, we're good. So let's get the blower housing back on. So I got you in here real close to see how to reconnect this. You can't get this cover off without disconnecting the governor rod. And to put it back in, you kind of have to come in at an angle to get both the anti-surge spring connected as well as the governor rod, which both go into the same hole here on the governor arm. So there's the spring. And the rod. And to reconnect this, the anti-surge spring also goes in the same hole as the governor rod. So you want to get the small spring in first, like that. And then this rod you just push in place. Like that. And I'm going to replace the worm gear drive clamp with a spring clamp because, you know, as the worm drive kind of pushes in, you know, the line becomes crushed and a little bit distorted. So it actually takes the tension off the connection over time, whereas the spring clamp will keep a constant pressure on there. And to be honest, these clamps, I don't know if they're really that critical. You know, the line isn't likely to come off without them, but this kind of guarantees it. Okay, and after all that, we can now bolt on the new recoil. And that should do it. We now have a brand new cup and starter recoil. So, you know, I do want to get this outside, just try it again, make sure everything is put together properly, and hopefully not have a repeat of this issue. Before I do that, though, I do want to swap the spark plug out. I am a little bit suspicious of it. You know, he said he was having a run issue, and we did see an issue with the governor, but I'm not sure if that was it, because when running under full load on gasoline at 6,500 watts, the engine cut out a few times, just for a split second. You could see it in the Hertz meter, and that is symptomatic of a failing spark plug. You know, I've had ones that run great under no load to kind of mid load, but as soon as you bring it up to full load, you're at maximum heat, maximum compression, and I often see plugs start to flake out, potentially like that one was. So we're going to get a brand new champion. This is an RC12YC. Interesting. It's actually an NGK, and looks like it has very little use. So I'm inclined to think this is not the problem. And given how new it looked, you know, potentially he already swapped it out after he had the problem. I'm not sure. But I think it would be prudent to put the OEM plug in its place. And one last thing I want to check, and that is the valve clearance, because the first time I pulled this engine over, although I could do it, it seemed like it had more compression than it should. And there is a decompression system on this, on the exhaust valve, but if that valve clearance is too great, then not enough compression is going to be released. So I want to double check that so we don't have a repeat with the new cup and recoil. And I'm hoping to save this gasket because I don't think I have another. Okay, good. Still in one piece. So the exhaust valve is open right now. Intake is not. I'm going to rotate the engine. We'll check the exhaust valve first once the intake opens up. Definitely not loose. If anything, it might be a little tight. So we'll start with the 6/1000. That does not fit. How about a 5? Nope. 4 doesn't fit either. So this is kind of the opposite problem. Meaning if it's a little tight, it's probably going to let more compression out. All right, 3/1000 just barely fits. Let's try the 4 again. No, 4 does not fit. So we're at 3/1000 on the exhaust. Let's see where the intake's at. And we'll start with the 4. 4 fits with a tiny bit of drag. And a 5 fits with a lot of drag. So I would say we're at a 5 on the intake, which seems correct. The exhaust on this engine, I think, should be 5 as well. But let me just double check that. So I just double checked the spec. And this engine actually is tighter than most. It calls for 3/1000 on both valves. So the exhaust is actually perfect. And the 3/1000, it is plus or minus 1/1000. So 4/1000 would be fine. You know, I estimate it's a touch above 4/1000, but you know, it's close enough that I don't think we need to make any adjustments here. I apologize for the wind noise. It is a pretty windy day, so I'll make this quick. I'm going to get the engine started. We're going to have to reset the engine speed. That no-load speed should be 61.5 Hertz. Once that's done, I'm just going to put on a half load of about 3,000 watts. I'm going to let that run for a good 5 minutes or so, and then I'm going to bring it up to the rated load of 6,500 watts while keeping an eye on the Hertz gauge. I want to see that the engine speed is stable. So no issues getting the machine started. Of course, the speed was slow. It was around 56 Hertz. So I brought that up to 61.5. So let's put on 3,000 watt load. Things look pretty stable. We'll give that a few minutes, and then we'll bump it up to 6,500 watts. Well, it's been just over 5 minutes. No issues at all pulling 3,000 watts. So let's bring the load up to 4,000, 6,000, nice and steady. How about 6,500? And yeah, it's doing it, but it did float down and back up. So we're kind of at the edge of what this machine can do. We're kind of out of horsepower, but that reaction seems pretty normal. So I'm going to take the load off. And the governor overreacted a little bit there. Let's keep taking the load off. And yeah, I'm happy with that. So he also mentioned there was an issue with the idle speed, or at least the idle control. So if you turn that on, he says it stalls out, but actually let's not do that yet. Let's give the load bank a chance to cool down, and then we'll give that a try. I think that's good enough. And we'll turn the idle control on. Turn the light off, and the kilowatt might have to be unplugged as well, though I guess not. Yeah, it's not going to do it. So it's actually bringing the speed down too much and just stalling the engine out. So let's first set the idle set screw on the carburetor, and then we'll fine tune the solenoid if we need to. Well, I think we're looking pretty good on this. I don't really see any major issues with this machine. I think the biggest issue was self-inflicted when I destroyed that starter cup and recoil. And I never really explained how that happened. All engines, whether you're talking small engines or the ones in your car, the spark happens in advance of top dead center. And the reason for that is because the explosion, that is a chemical reaction. And that, although it happens fast, it does need a little bit of time to build. So you have to spark the fuel in advance of top dead center. That way, when the piston's on its way down, that explosion is in full force. In my case, I pulled it over fast enough to get a spark, but I didn't make it past top dead center. That explosion happened, rotated the engine backwards, and caused all the damage that we saw. Anyway, as far as the run condition of this machine, I didn't really see anything terrible with it, at least not like the owner was describing. Potentially he swapped that plug out and fixed the issue before we even got it. That said, though, there were a couple issues. I would say the biggest one was the governor sensitivity. Before we adjusted the position of the spring, this engine was surging under load, which is not ideal. So we moved that out one position, and like that, it now runs under load, nice and stable. And it is still a little bit overly sensitive. We actually just saw that when we took the load off. We saw the engine oscillate for a few seconds and then recover. So technically we could move this further out. The only downside is that you're going to lose sensitivity, meaning the engine's going to lose speed under load. So it's kind of a balance, and where it's at right now is probably the best spot that it can be for this engine. So the governor issues are sorted, and so is the idle speed. I couldn't adjust it per Generac's procedures. They actually recommend setting the idle set screw a couple hundred RPM below the target. In this case, I couldn't drive the idle set screw in far enough to affect the idle. And I think that's because the propane modification is interfering with that set screw. So instead, just adjusted the solenoid to the desired speed, which in this case was 45 Hertz, and that seemed to work just fine. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.